going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the J Area Podcast. My name is Jose Ramos Jr., and this is where I share some of my favorite films with you all. I also discuss how each film was developed and analyze what makes them significant. And with this upcoming Friday being October 13th, in honor of Friday the 13th, I figured it would be a perfect opportunity to not only cover the first Friday film, but part 2 as well. It is no understatement that Friday the 13th is among one of the more popular slasher films of all time. As we already covered, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween is another one, Scream being one of my favorites. But the original Friday the 13th film was released May 9th, 1980, and was produced/directed by Sean S. Cunningham. The Friday franchise spawned a total of 11 sequels that included Jason Goes to Hell, He Goes to Space, He Visits Elm Street, and even the brutal 2009 reboot. But we're going to keep it simple and follow the first film, which was much more small scale, as you can see in the original 4 Friday films. The first Friday film follows a group of camp counselors trying to reopen a summer camp called Crystal Lake, which has a grim past and is stalked by a mysterious killer. In terms of production, Cunningham had previously worked on The Last House on the Left with Wes Craven of Nightmare on Elm Street and Scream fame. Along with this, and being inspired by John Carpenter's Halloween, he wanted to make Friday the 13th to be shocking, visually stunning, and make you jump out of your seat. Its original title was A Long Night at Camp Blood. I think that title could have worked on its own, but being with the aura of Friday the 13th and the reputation and superstition that Friday the 13th carries, I think in terms of name value and branding and marketing, Friday the 13th was certainly a smarter decision on that point. By no means are the Friday the 13th film masterpieces. These are just movies for dumb fun. It's a good time to put on one of these movies, just watch it with a couple friends, and be able to watch these naive, dumb, clueless characters. Like when you watch a Friday the 13th film, you might as well not get too attached to any of them. There might be a couple that you might get attached to, and they might end up being one of the final girls or the final combatants in the film. But it's very rare that you get attached to one of these characters. I look at this first film as a perfect example because we're introduced to Annie Phillips early on. She's a camp counselor / a cook, and she's looking for a ride. She's going around, she goes to a diner. She asks the attendees of the diner, who's going down this way, maybe I can get a ride. And she eventually gets a ride from a truck driver. Upon watching this film for the first time, and I've seen this film several times, but I can remember the very first time I watched this movie, Annie Phillips just comes off as so naive. She's far too stupid for her own good. And I wondered to myself, is that just an example of the times? Were people back then just so naive? Because you think back to like hitchhikers, for example, you could get a ride with anybody. And this is how certain serial killers like a Ted Bundy would capitalize and take advantage of their victims. Of course, now saying that out loud, we look at the Uber services that are provided now, and you essentially can catch a ride with any stranger as well. But the times back then, I don't know if it's just the way they portray the characters or if that's just how society was back then, but a lot of these teens are just too dumb for their own good. Eventually, Annie Phillips does get a ride, and she rides about halfway to Camp Crystal Lake and is dropped off by the truck driver, and so she has to search for another ride, essentially. She does get another ride by a figure that we never see. Of course, it's later revealed to be Pamela Voorhees, but in that scene, the way she just talks, she's basically having a conversation with herself. We're in the point of view of Pamela Voorhees. And if I'm Pamela Voorhees, I would have immediately asked Annie to get out of my car because this a conversation that she carries only makes me want to root for Pamela Voorhees even more. Essentially, there's a scene where Annie realizes that they didn't take the turn that they were supposed to take for the Camp Crystal Lake. You can see the panic begin to arise on her face. She's trying to freak out. She's looking around, looking for a way of exit. And she opens the door and jumps headfirst out of a moving car. And you can tell it was 2 separate takes of her hopping out of the car, and then the second take being of her doing this landing on the ground. She lands headfirst into the dirt. If Pamela Voorhees wouldn't have killed her, that fall would have, because you can't land headfirst into a somersault out of a moving vehicle and expect to live, let alone be able to get back up and run. There's no way. I refuse to believe that this small teen was able to outrun Pamela Voorhees after jumping out of a moving car. Essentially, she doesn't, get away from Pamela Voorhees. She is actually murdered. But I just found that very funny and very entertaining that her first instinct was to jump out the car, which I can't blame her. At that point, you're getting desperate. You want to get out of, any means necessary. But the take of her doing a somersault into the dirt just gets me laughing every time. And it's not the only time in this movie where you see one of the characters doing something questionable. Because a lot of times with these movies, you can catch yourself kind of evaluating the scenario and thinking, oh, well, if I was in that particular dilemma, I would do this. And I feel like that's part of the fun in these movies as well, is that you can get a group of friends and just watch it and make fun of these characters and just discuss, like, man, this guy's doing something so dumb. Like, I would never do that. But of course, it's a different situation because when the pressure's on and you're in that moment, sometimes we do dumb things. Another example of that is just towards the end. So Alice is running away from our mysterious killer, and she's running through the cabins. She's moving cabin to cabin until finally getting to the main cabin, and she swings open the door. And upon entering the building, the door from the outside pulls out. So if you're standing in the building, the door goes forward. But if you're on the outside of the building, you're pulling the door from the outside, and you'd be pushing it from the inside. That's very important information for this particular scene. So what she does is she closes the door. She pulls the door closed from inside. She then begins to tie the knob to one of the pillars. So one of the pillars inside the cabin. Good start. Great start. This is very smart, very innovative, especially under the circumstances. So she ties the knot around the doorknob and tries to secure it. So if the killer were to pull the door open, it won't be able to because the rope is holding it down. But then in sheer panic, she then begins to barricade the door with stuff like the couch, the table, random bags, just random junk. Not even barricading it, it's just covering maybe like a yard, 3 feet of the door from the bottom. And I just find that, again, I find it very funny because if the killer is able to amass the strength to swing that door open, essentially just breaking that rope, what does all that do in terms of barricading? If it was the other way around and the door swung open from the inside, okay, you can barricade it and kind of prevent it from opening. But the barricading of all those items essentially does nothing. And it's one of those scenes that every time I watch this movie, I just laugh at because it's like, that makes no sense. But again, I have to give her credit because in that moment, in that sense of panic, you don't know what you're going to do. You're going to grab anything you can, to fend off and defend yourself. But I just thought it was a big waste of time, essentially. But again, these movies aren't masterpieces. They're not meant to be taken so seriously as a form of entertainment. It's not supposed to be something that we should deep dive into. But I just can't help but look at it and find those really funny. Like I said, these characters, you're not meant to get too attached to them because they're just, at this point, sheep getting ready to slaughter. Or sheep getting ready to be slaughtered, I should say. But there is one character that really stands out in this film, and it's Crazy Ralph. Crazy Ralph serves the role of the red herring, the character that you're meant to kind of be suspicious about and look at as one of those maybe it's them type of characters, but essentially it's not. And Crazy Ralph is not that. He appears in random locations and tries to warn the camp counselors or anybody that will listen about that, this camp is cursed based off of the events that had occurred in prior years. And I feel like with any tale, especially if you look at like a movie like The Texas Chainsaw, there's always those kind of characters that are kind of crazy, kind of wacky, and just aren't of the norm. And they're meant to kind of throw you off, but also kind of serve as like a hermit or a harbinger of what is to come. And in terms of just telling a story, they are necessary. And although they might seem a little bit silly and wacky, as I mentioned, the character of Crazy Ralph is definitely a fan favorite of the Friday franchise. An interesting note, this may not be a character, but I did find this interesting. Upon entering the camp location, a lot of the counselors are still trying to get acclimated and get accustomed to their surrounding, kind of get settled in to the campgrounds. And in one scene, a snake is inside the cabin. And being that this is in 1980, they didn't have any kind of CGI or robotic snake. So it is a live snake in the cabin. There's a real snake, on set. And essentially in the scene where they kill the snake, they decapitate the snake. I forget if it's the character of Jack, who was played by Kevin Bacon, a very young Kevin Bacon, by the way. But they essentially kill the snake with a machete, which gained a lot of controversy and criticism from outside groups. Obviously, like a PETA sort of type of group, because they killed a live snake rather than having some kind of prop or do some kind of camera angle where it suggested that the snake was killed. And upon watching it, that is wild to think that on the real set they killed a real snake. I just find that very fascinating. Another fascinating part of this film franchise is its use of camera shots. Its point of view camera shots that are used are obviously inspired by Halloween, the opening of Halloween, where Michael Myers is first introduced as a kid, murdering his older sister. There's a lot of inspiration from Halloween in this film, but namely the point of view. It places us in the eyes of the killer, which is a unique perspective to be told from, because obviously we want to be able to identify with the heroes. We want to be able to identify with the good guys in the story. But by placing us in the position of the killer, we are now looking through their eyes. We're seeing the drama. We're seeing the trauma. We're seeing that sense of desperation that these teens are going through upon seeing someone with a knife or someone with some kind of weapon. And I think that's also part of what glorified the slasher genre, is that we are now placed in these positions that we normally would not be in, or at least I hope we would not be in a reality. So to be able to be placed in the eyes of the killer and not know who the killer is, which adds another layer of fun to it, because early on, upon first watching, we don't know who the killer is. It's a mysterious figure going around, and obviously there are certain elements to where it is suggested that it's a male, but it's not. Obviously Friday the 13th, now running on 43 years, if you don't know who the killer in the first Friday the 13th film is, I don't know what to tell you there. And it's certainly not Jason, who we'll get to in a moment. But I just find those camera shots very interesting. The only complaint I have with them is like the slow motion kills. And it's nothing terrible, it's nothing bad, but you can kind of tell like it's aged, because the early Friday films, a lot of kill shots are in slow motion. For example, there's the Pamela Voorhees decapitation at the end. Now that's to add more drama and add more suspense, add a little bit of more flavor to the scene itself. I can't get over the timing of it. You know what I mean? Everything's just slowed down, and it's meant to come off as dramatic. But being now that 43 years have passed and seeing so much other films and seeing other techniques of camera angles and shots, it's very interesting to see how almost, I don't want to say archaic, but it's very, very old school, if you will. It does heighten the drama. It does add suspense. And upon watching this, I thought back to the film Freddy vs. Jason. And a lot of people had complained in that film that there were these sudden shots of like slow motion and like blurred movements, and it might have been just like an early 2000s thing, but for me that raised the question of like, hey, maybe they unintentionally put that in the film as a way to like reference or pay tribute to these early Friday films where slow motion was such in heavy use. Now maybe that's a reach and maybe that's not a thing, but I would like to think from my own thought process that Freddy vs. Jason kind of honors that original Friday camera shot of the slow motion kill. And that's essentially what these movies were about. Teens getting slaughtered by an unknown assailant. And this franchise really serves as like a cautionary tale for these teens who are doing, deviant behavior. A lot of these films are focused on drug use, alcohol, sex, and it's what inspires the rules for like the Scream franchise, the blueprint for what slashers would become. But to see it done in this first film, again, it's early into the slasher genre, because before this we had movies like Halloween and Black Christmas, who were kind of like viewed as the standard bearer of the genre. But what I really enjoy about this film is how everyone is warning the counselors about the events of 1957 and 1958. The film takes place in like 1980 or 1979, depending on who you ask. But in 1957, this is when a young boy named Jason Voorhees, you might have heard of him, had drowned in the lake at Camp Crystal Lake. And in 1958, which is how this film opens up, two camp counselors end up straying away from the group, break away, and go on their own, and essentially are participating in extracurricular activities, we will say. And they are eventually killed by an unknown killer. So what I always enjoyed about it is it has this sense of like a ghost story, like a campfire story that you would tell others to kind of get them scared and get them riled up. And it just builds and builds on the legacy of Camp Crystal Lake, because everyone that goes there is essentially warned by the people who live around it. Like, hey, don't go there. This is what happened, or this is what could happen, and this place is cursed. It's a death wish. And again, just going back to those harbingers, to those red herrings of characters who are warning our clueless camp counselors of Camp Crystal Lake. And for anybody that knows me and that has been following this podcast, you know that every episode that I do, I try to intertwine every episode into the next one. And the common theme between this one and last week's episode, which was Psycho, which I highly suggest you check out. It's, again, one of the greatest slashers of all time. It's a good movie, not only just in terms of the genre, but just what it does for the future of film. So I highly suggest you check out the Psycho episode. But being that film kind of centers around the relationship between a mother and son, very much on hand with this franchise, we're able to see the difference between a loving and nurturing relationship between a mother and their son versus that of vengeance and violence. You see, it's something different, being that we're seeing the mother, Pamela Voorhees, in the role of a killer. It's something different. It's not, at this point, it hadn't really been done before, and if it hadn't been done on this scale in terms of film. And when you think about it, Pamela Voorhees, her biggest gripe with the camp counselors is that you were neglecting my son. You were off busy, doing extracurricular activities and not watching my boy. You weren't watching my son. You neglected him. You failed to do the one thing you are responsible for as a camp counselor, and that's to watch over these young boys and girls. So one could argue that her reasoning behind this whole ordeal does have some merit to it. Now, is it a little bit extreme? Is it a little bit, too much for one to handle? You could argue that. But if you were placed in her position, any parent who loses a son or a daughter that young, they're going to be upset, and it might drive them to commit some crime like that. So I do think it's interesting to see it on both sides. These camp counselors who, some of them might not be directly responsible for it, but because of the stigma and because of the vengeance that Pamela Voorhees has, it does merit some sort of reasoning behind it. It may not be the perfect film, this original Friday the 13th film, but what it's able to lay down in terms of the foundation of what the franchise would become cannot be ignored. While watching this movie again, for the purpose of this episode, there were times where I thought this film is actually pretty slow. And when it's good, it's really good. But when it's slow, it's really slow. One of the iconic scenes in the film, obviously, is the ending scene. It's very angelic. We're playing music, and we see the final girl, Alice, in a boat on the lake. Very angelic scene, and it's actually a jump scare where the drowned young boy, Jason Voorhees, appears from the lake attacking Alice. And the film ends with her essentially recovering in a hospital, and it all appears to be a dream. And she talks to, the doctor about, what about the young boy? And he says, young boy, there was no young boy that was recovered. There was no one else. And she makes the comment of, well, then he's still there. And that scene is just very, very chilling. Of course, it's obviously nowadays it's cliched because it's been done to death. But when you think of the concept and when this was originally released, that's really well done. It was so well done that it inspired a sequel, which we will get to. That's Friday the 13th, Part 2. But this original ending was inspired by the ending of Carrie. The jump scare of when she pops her hand out through the ground. Jump scares are always something fun, even though if they're overdone, they still can be fun when done right. This film is very notable for its iconic kills. For example, Kevin Bacon's character Jack is killed with an arrow through his neck from under the bed, which in itself is a very interesting way that they were able to do that. They had like a prosthetic neck where it was attached to Kevin Bacon, and he was kind of sitting underneath the bed where there was like an opening. So it was just his head going through, and they have like this prosthetic neck, and they just pop the arrow through. It's very well done, and I highly suggest you look that up on YouTube on how they were able to do it, especially with the tubing and how they were to pop out the blood through his neck. It's very interesting. I highly suggest you look that up. The character Marcy, she's killed with an axe in one of the more comical kills of the film because of just the scream. She has this like slow wail before eventually she's just axed in the scene. There's also Brenda, who hears a small child screaming out for help on the outside, and she begins to follow it, of course, as a concerned camp counselor that she is. But the lights on the campus suddenly turn on, and this leads to her screaming. We don't see what happens to her. We just know that something happens to her. Same thing with like the boss, Steve. After he returns to the camp, he's quickly killed by the mysterious figure who just shines a light in his face and we don't see what happens. That's a lot of this in this early film, and I think it was because of the restrictions they had in terms of the violence and what the MPAA was able to allow. But as I mentioned, this film really brings in popularity to the slasher genre, and not only to the genre, but to the name Voorhees, because this is where it all begins. It's not the best movie, as I mentioned, but it's certainly one that you need to put on if you want to have a fun time with your friends, or just put something on in the background to laugh at, in my opinion. And the reason for this episode that I decided to go back to back and do a double feature between Friday Part 1 and Friday Part 2 is because essentially they are very similar in the structure. They're basically the same movie. The only difference is who the killer is and who the killer is killing. Friday the 13th Part 2, directed by Steve Miner, was released May 1st, 1981, a year later. But in the film, it's taking place 5 years after the first installment. Part 2 follows a similar premise with an unknown stalker killing a group of camp counselors at a training camp near Crystal Lake. Now, following the success of that first film, Paramount began to plan for a sequel. Originally, the Friday the 13th series was intended to be an anthology series that focused on the Friday the 13th superstition, where it could be an event that teenagers would visit the theater for the latest episode of the series. It would happen once a year and have no continuity whatsoever and be its own movie without having any connections to its predecessor. Due to a well-received reaction to the ending of the original film, filmmakers opted to continue the story of Jason Voorhees. They were convinced to bring Jason back for this film. And although Sean Cunningham didn't return as a director/writer, much of the old crew did, so they maintained that sense of continuity of the crew, which is always a welcome sight. Adrienne King, who played Alice in the original film, was also contacted to return to play, the role of the heroine. But prior to this film, and after the release of the original, King had been stalked by an obsessed fan and wanted as small as a role as possible. Adrienne King had numerous encounters with stalkers and essentially avoided doing any major acting roles after that first film. The original ending included Mrs. Voorhees' head opening her eyes and smiling toward the camera, but was cut due to the director Steve Miner thinking it was just too campy, it was too silly, and to this day that footage of that alternate ending has never been released. So as for the film itself, we have returning Adrienne King as Alice, and this is 2 months after the original film. She's still recovering from the traumatic experience that she, had in the first film, and we get a full recap of the ending in the first film. So you can essentially skip that first 10 minutes because it's just recapping what happened. So if you watch these movies back to back, there's a good 10 minutes that you can skip over. We do follow Alice into her apartment, and we get a chance to check in on the only sole survivor from that first film. But what might be quite possibly one of the earliest references to Psycho, she goes into her fridge and she finds the severed head of Pamela, in which she decapitated only 2 months prior. And she is then killed with an ice pick, again killing the star of the film, the hero, early on in the movie, just like Psycho did in 1960. Now after this death, 5 years have passed, and we're introduced to a new set of counselors as Paul Hoyt is the main counselor. We meet characters like Sandra, her boyfriend Jeff, friends Scott, Terry, Mark, Vicky, Ted, and Ginny. Now, of the group, the only one you really need to remember is Ginny. Ginny is our final girl. She is our hero of the story. She is one of the smarter final girls in the Friday franchise. She's depicted as a young, bright girl who questions the tale of Jason Voorhees and is really the only counselor who really considers the trauma that he has sustained. She uses her head as she's able to get into the psyche of Jason Voorhees upon their confrontation towards the end of the film. Of course, I forgot to mention that Crazy Ralph does return, but he's actually killed after wandering onto the site in order to warn them. So we get rid of Crazy Ralph. And what might be one of the more forgettable roles of Jason Voorhees, and not for any particular reason, but because it's just so early on. It's our first appearance of Jason Voorhees as the main killer. But for me personally, I've always found this portrayal of Jason to be one of the more unsettling ones in the franchise, because Jason grows up to be, a grown adult, and aside from some of the trauma or the physical deformities that he has, he is just an average guy in a burlap sack, just running around. It's a very physical performance, and as he does run after his prey, and he possesses this sense of urgency that we miss in future installments, because he's able to basically teleport once we get to the supernatural Jason. But one thing I credit to the actor who plays Jason here is his eyes. In the scene where Ginny is pretending to be his mother, and she's kind of commanding him to kneel down And he follows this because, again, he sees his mother. He is entranced. He's traumatized by that event of losing his mom. And you can see in his eyes when he realizes that it's not her, that it's Ginny trying to play a fast one on him. And being that we're so restricted to his face and we can't see his reactions, it's all in the eyes, it's all in the body language. And I have to give real credit to the actor who portrayed Jason in this film. Essentially, as going back to that original film, there's talk about urban legend. Around the campfire, Paul tells the counselors about the legend of Jason Voorhees, his drowning, and the events in 1958 and 1979 that I previously mentioned. It also kind of surrounds the idea of trauma. What has Jason seen? How has his perception of life been altered? And how he views life and death, or right and wrong. He's not like the average person. This kid, was essentially drowned, sees his mother get decapitated in front of his own eyes, and what that does to one's psyche, and what that does to their mentality and their way of thinking. It can lead them down a dark path. And essentially we see that with Jason Voorhees, because Pamela went on that stretch of kills because of her son's drowning, and now it's Jason avenging his mother who was killed by a camp counselor. So it's just circle of life in full circle. And of course, what kind of film would it be? What kind of Friday film would it be if we did not have some iconic kills? Jason Voorhees is among one of the more prolific and creative slasher killers in the genre. Of course, there's a scene where Sandra and Jeff are in the bed together, and he has a spear shoot right through both of them as a kebab. Again, one of the more creative scenes that we see in this film. Mark, who is one of the characters who's bound to a wheelchair, and he ends up getting hacked in the face with some kind of machete and is wheeled down these sets of steps. And again, it's one of those slow motion freeze frames close up that it does. One of those wacky camera angles that the Friday films became notorious for. But again, one of the more iconic ones as well. As well as Jason, he gets the machete to his shoulder and in slow motion just falls to the ground. A reference, not even a reference, but more so something that inspired the Friday the 13th game, where if you were to attack Jason, he just falls slowly and, hits the ground. But these movies, of course, are solely reliant on adolescent interests. It's a way to bring in a group of teens who want to have a good time and watch these movies, watch naive characters act foolish and ultimately pay for it. And it's one of those, like I said, those conversation starters that you can have where you see these characters do something and it's like, if that were me, I would do this instead. But these early Friday films are very similar in terms of its structure. It's not the best, I will say, and they do continue to improve, and they wouldn't really find their footing until Chapter 4, in my opinion, when they introduced the character of Tommy Jarvis. But it set in motion what the tone of the series could become, as well as what the genre would eventually evolve into. It remains one of the more successful franchises, not only in horror, but in just film in general. And I feel like that's why it was so important to cover this, not only as an opportunity to talk about two Friday films at once, but as a way to kind of get us ready for this upcoming Friday the 13th. And when we will expect another Friday the 13th film, who knows? Because that's up to licensing and the rights and the studios who want to produce that film. Obviously, there's a lot of marketing and cachet to be capitalized on with the franchise and its line of property. But I think it'll still be some time before we see something related to Jason Voorhees. But until then, we'll just have to wait patiently for the next installments of Friday the 13th. I want to thank you guys again, of course, for joining me on this episode every week, every Monday, every movie Monday. J Area Podcast covers another film. And if you guys want to find me, I am at justjose_3 on Twitter and on TikTok if you want to find some shorter videos of these episodes, as well as Did You Know Facts. Please follow the YouTube channel and subscribe. We're doing big numbers now. We're slowly growing, slowly but surely. But again, I appreciate you guys and your support. Of course, this has been the J Area Podcast. My name is Jose Ramos Jr., and we will catch you again next week with a new movie.